Do you guys remember when you were little and you would go to a friend's house to stay the night? Maybe you were invited at the last minute and all you needed to stay the night were the clothes on your back. You didn't worry about brushing your teeth. You always had your finger you could rub the toothpaste on, that sort of thing. And all you needed, you didn't need to take a shower. You didn't need to worry about any of those things. But as you get older, you have to take more and more things along with you. Some of you, when you take a trip somewhere, you have a suitcase for your clothes, a suitcase for your shoes, a suitcase for your hair accessories. I don't know. But you have many, many bags that you take with you. When you especially have kids, the amount of junk you have to take with you, you can't just go overnight somewhere. Especially if you have like a little toddler, you have to have your suitcases, you have to have snacks, you have to have a cooler, you have to have a pack and play, you have to have all sorts of stuff to drag along with you. So no trip overnight is a quick thing at all, unless you pawn them off at somebody else's house, which is awesome when that happens. Because you can send them with nothing and make them deal with it. Back in June, we went on a trip to Indianapolis for a church convention. When we wanted to save a little money on parking, instead of paying the $30 a day at the hotel, which was absolutely ridiculous, we got some off-site parking, which was a lot cheaper overall, which was great. We dropped our luggage off at the hotel, and we put it on a cart, and it was a fancy place, so they brought the luggage up to us. That was so nice. But there was a little issue getting it back to the parking lot because we had to take a shuttle back, and Sarah had to stay with the kids. So this was a hilarious sight. I was bound and determined to get all this luggage on the shuttle by myself, get it off into the car by myself. So I had this suitcase, a bigger suitcase, a couple of other duffel bags. I had a cooler. I had the pack and play. I had a pillow. I had like everything, okay? My computer bag, everything. And I got everything onto that, on that shuttle. But I looked like a total idiot. And then I get off, and I'm by myself, and I thankfully can get it off a little bit at a time. And then I picked it all up again and carted it off to the car. I am not a weakling, although that probably did mess up my back. But it was just so frustrating that, yes, we were there for like 4 days, but we had to take the whole house with us. It was so frustrating to bring along all of that baggage. I just long for the days we can just throw a couple things in a bag and be done with it. But as we go through life, we all pick up all sorts of baggage. We pick up the luggage that we carry around with us from one moment to the next. We pick up guilt from our mistakes. There is emotional trauma. Sometimes there are physical scars from things that we experience. So we tend to accumulate suitcases full of regrets. We often express regret by saying, if only. If only that didn't happen to me. If only I didn't make that choice. If only I had known what I know now, things would turn out differently. Or if only I had better priorities. If only I had taken God more seriously. If only. So how do we handle those regrets? We bring along the luggage and we look like a fool like me getting out of that shuttle with all of that stuff on my back. That's what it looks like for us when we get older in life and we carry around that baggage. How do we handle it? How do we keep the mistakes that we made yesterday or 10 years ago from messing up today or tomorrow? Today we're going to be looking at the story of Joseph. And hopefully, as we look at the story, we're going to see that there's a lot of baggage being accumulated by many people. There's a lot of regret. It's a story full of regret, a story full of if-onlys. And as we look at this story, and today we're going to look at it from the overall perspective of the grand story of what's happening, and then we're going to break it down and look at it from the perspective of different people who were involved in the story. And we're going to kind of dissect or open up the bags and see what they are accumulating and see how the best way to deal with our baggage is. So hopefully, by the end of it, we can realize what God wants to do with the baggage that we accumulate. The details of Joseph's life begin to emerge for us around Genesis chapter 37. We find that his family has settled into the land of Canaan, but they're not going to be there permanently. This is the land that God had promised to Abraham many years before, that his descendants would inherit the land, but it wasn't quite time for them to have it. But Joseph grew up in a very convoluted family. There were several baby mamas. There was lots of drama. His mom Rachel and his father Jacob, or his father was Jacob, his mother was Rachel, and there was all sorts of drama about other baby mamas and other things that were involved. A lot of stress for Joseph and his family, especially as Jacob is trying to wrap his mind around promises that God had given to him and how he was going to be the father of a great nation, all sorts of things that were happening. But one of the very first things that we read about in chapter 37 is the tension between Joseph and his brothers. When he was 17, he was sent out by his father, presumably, to bring a report back on how his brothers were doing. But Joseph brings back a bad report. In other words, Joseph narked on some stupid things that his brother were doing. And so this made them absolutely angry. And to make the tension even worse, Joseph, we read, was Jacob's favorite son. He loved him so much because he was born to Rachel, his favorite wife, and in his old age. And so he was very special to Jacob. And he made his feelings known and shown. If you have favorite children, you don't let the other kids know that you have a favorite child. Okay? You pretend like you love them all the same. Okay, I'm giving him some trauma right here. He's going to have to talk to a counselor about that later. But he made him know, and he made it so known that he crafted this beautiful coat for Joseph to have that was full of many different colors. It was beyond expense in craftsmanship. It was absolutely beautiful to show how special Joseph was. But this made his other brothers extremely angry. They were jealous. They resented the fact that they were less loved than Joseph. And then, to make matters worse, Joseph started having some dreams, some really weird dreams. Not the kind of dreams that you have after you have had some bad Mexican food, or not the kind of dreams that you have when you're really stressed out about something and you're worried and you have all these really strange dreams about how everything just breaks down in your life and is based off of the stress that you have. These aren't those kind of dreams. But instead of keeping the dreams to himself, he let his brothers and his family know what he has been dreaming about. And when you listen to the dreams, it is very obvious that Joseph is dreaming about his father and his mother and his brothers coming and bowing down before him. Okay, they already have a problem with Joseph thinking he is all that. They already have a problem with everybody, Jacob, holding Joseph up as somebody who is super awesome. They will not bow down to him, no matter what. They are extremely angry about what Joseph is saying. And then we read that they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. So it wasn't just the dreams, because you can't really help the kind of dreams that you have, even though sometimes when you dream something, like if you dream that you're angry at somebody, sometimes you wake up and you're still angry at that person, and we act kind of weird based off our dreams. Joseph cannot help what he is dreaming about here, but there are some other words that he is adding on to it. It wasn't just the dreams or the telling of the dreams. It was also, quote unquote, his words. There was more to it than just sharing the dreams. So they could take it no longer. So one day, while Joseph's brothers were with a flock in Shechem, which was north of the land that they had settled in, Jacob wanted to know again how the brothers were doing, how the flock was doing. And so, we got to remember what happened earlier when this happened. He gives a report. They had done something apparently that was not so good. Joseph told And it didn't go over so well. They did not like a narc, a snitch, or a rat. They did not like him tattling on their stupid behavior. Never mind the fact that maybe they were doing something stupid and they should have owned their mistakes. They didn't like Joseph giving reports. But Joseph goes to go and find his brothers, go on this long journey to find them. But they're not where they're supposed to be. He gets to Shechem, and they are not there. And then something hilarious happens, at least in my mind. In verse 15 we read, "And a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, 'What are you seeking?' 'I'm seeking my brothers,' he said. 'Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock?' And the man said, 'They have gone away, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan.' So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan." So this guy happens upon Joseph while he is apparently out wandering in the fields looking lost. Any of you ladies who have ever been with a man who gets lost and they have that look about their face that they're lost but they're not going to ask for directions. Joseph is just out there lost, wandering in the fields. And somebody happens upon him and says, "Hey, what are you looking for?" "Obviously, they're not there, Joseph. Move on. You can see from miles around, they're not there. Go move along." But Joseph is just using this opportunity to go on a nice hike through the country. "Oh, my brothers aren't here, so what?" So he is told that they're in Dothan, and he goes off to find what they're doing and where they're at and how the flock is doing. But his brothers, they can see Joseph coming from a long way off, maybe a mile or two down the road. You know, if you're on the top of a hill, you can see for quite a long ways. And so as they see him coming, they make a plan to kill him. Reuben says, "Why don't we just throw him in a pit, leave him to die?" And now secretly in his mind, he's planning to come back and rescue Joseph out of this pit. He sees that his brothers are acting crazy and irrational, and he wants to try to do something to help Joseph. Even though he probably is a little bit bitter himself, he makes this plan to just throw him in the pit and leave him to die, hoping to come back later. And so Joseph came, they rip off his cloak, and they throw him in the pit. And apparently Reuben has gone off somewhere else, so he cannot intervene on behalf of Joseph. And before he can get back, a caravan of traders come along. And the brothers think, man, we can kill two birds with one stone. We can get rid of this problem, and we can get a little bit of coin in our pockets for whatever we want. And so they sell Joseph into slavery. He is taken to Egypt. He is bought by Potiphar, who happens to be the captain of Pharaoh's guard. Meanwhile, the brothers have to lie to their father. They kill an animal and they sprinkle the blood on the coat to make it look like Joseph had been ripped apart by a wild animal. So their father is stricken down by grief. Jacob is absolutely devastated. He is going to go to the grave. For the rest of his life, he is going to be mourning the loss of Joseph, who was born to Rachel, his most beloved wife. So the favored son, the one who had been put on this pedestal by his father, who was so special, was humiliated. He was betrayed. He was sent to a foreign land as a slave. Things were so good for Joseph. He had a bright future ahead of him. And then everything came tumbling down. If only the family dynamics were healthier. If only Reuben had gotten there sooner. If only the traders refused to sell people as property. If only Joseph had not gone to check on his brothers. If only things worked out differently. But despite whatever regrets Joseph and his brothers and his father began to accumulate, God was not done. Something greater than helping Joseph was being accomplished. Now in chapter 39, we read in verse 2 that the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving the household of his Egyptian master. When the master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord made him everything he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. God was making Joseph successful in everything that he did, and as a result, he was put in charge of Potiphar's household. This was a high official in Egypt, and Joseph was responsible for this guy's property, for his kids, for his animals, everything that he owned. He had a great trust and responsibility. Things were beginning to look up for Joseph. All that terror of his brothers was being replaced by the blessings of Potiphar's household. That is, until Potiphar's wife began to notice him. He's about 17, 18 years old. He's young and muscly and handsome. She wanted Joseph to fulfill some need that she had. And day after day, she tried to seduce him. But being unwilling to break trust with his master and unwilling to sin against God, he repeatedly, day after day, said, "No, I will not." And so she was rejected and angry. And one day Joseph again resisted and he ran out of the house in a hurry. But she was apparently so handsy with Joseph that she had his coat in her hands when he left. And thinking on her feet, she says, "Ah!" And people come running as she is screaming and they want to know what's going on. And she says, "Well, Joseph tried to force himself on me." And so Joseph was put in a dire predicament. Potiphar was enraged that Joseph would try to force himself on his wife. But instead of having Joseph killed, which would have been understandable, he instead threw him into prison. Once again, things were going so good for Joseph until they come crashing down. This is like one of those annoying movies where you have a character who things maybe seem to go well for them, and then one thing after another happens in their life and they can never get ahead. They are always 2 steps behind, never proceeding forward. Everything seems to be going wrong in the life of Joseph. Every time he has something, it is taken away. If only Potiphar had paid more attention to his wife. If only Joseph had set better boundaries about being near a woman and alone in the house with her. If only things worked out differently. So despite whatever regret Joseph continued to accumulate and the baggage they continued to acquire, God was not done yet. Something greater than helping Joseph was being accomplished. Way over in chapter 39 we read, "But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. He granted him favor with the prison warden. The warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority, and he was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything that he did successful." Again, we see that God is bringing favor to Joseph. He's giving him success. But no matter how things were looking up for Joseph, he was still in prison. There was no release date. There was no income. There was no making a better life for himself. He was still confined to the walls of that prison, unable to do anything greater than be in charge of the other prisoners. Then one day, 2 of Pharaoh's servants are thrown into prison. There's the cupbearer and the baker. There's a guy who is responsible for making sure that Pharaoh's wine is not poisoned, so he drinks it before Pharaoh. And then there's the baker who is insured with making sure, again, that the food is not poisoned and that he creates some really tasty bread and food for the king, Pharaoh. And then these 2 guys begin to have dreams themselves. They're confused about the dreams that are in their minds. And so Joseph tells them that God would interpret the dreams. And so they take a risk and they tell Joseph what is going on in their minds. And it turns out that the cupbearer is going to be restored to his position of honor before Pharaoh. But the baker, his life would be taken from him. Both of them, their heads would be lifted up, one in honor and one in death. And so Joseph asked the cupbearer, knowing that he is going to be restored to his position of power, when you get back to Pharaoh, remember me. Maybe finally Joseph would be freed from prison. But again, things don't work out for Joseph. The cupbearer forgets about him. He's too busy enjoying his position of honor. He's too busy enjoying the king's court. He's too busy with his job, and he forgets. For 2 more years, Joseph languishes in that Egyptian prison until Pharaoh starts to have bad dreams. Much more disturbing than those that are caused by bad Mexican food. Much more than salmonella poisoning. These were dreams that were driven by something far more severe. He dreams of 7 fat cows who get devoured by 7 sickly cows. He's absolutely confused about what is going to happen. And no one could explain the meaning. And then it hit him. That is the cupbearer. The cupbearer remembered that there was this guy back in his prison days who had interpreted his dream. And so Pharaoh summons Joseph and he asks for an interpretation. And Joseph again says that God, it's not me who's going to give you an interpretation, but it is God who's going to do so. And so he begins to explain. Pharaoh tells him the dream of these cows and a similar dream about wheat. And he says that, okay, we're about to have 7 good years. There's going to be lots of grain. There's going to be abundance in the land of Egypt. But those 7 years are going to be followed by a severe famine. And then after he is done interpreting the dream, Joseph goes a step further and he begins to tell Pharaoh how to handle this upcoming situation. He gives them a plan for helping Egypt survive the severe famine that is 7 years in the future. And so Pharaoh appoints Joseph to do exactly that. He sees that Joseph is wise, that not only does he understand the dreams, but he also understands logistics and planning and authority. So Joseph was put in a position where he is second in charge of all Egypt. And so they follow his plan. They store up a large abundance of grain, so much grain that they eventually have to stop keeping track of how much grain that they have. For 7 years, they continue to fill their silos. So things were looking good. Joseph was successful. The nation was prospering. But all the while, Joseph knows that at the end of these 7 years, there's going to be 7 very challenging years. There's going to be a prolonged famine. They have prepared logistically. But are they going to survive the stress that is brought about by the famine? So the famine came just as it was foretold. It didn't just impact Egypt. It wasn't a localized famine. The surrounding region up into Canaan was absolutely desperate for food, and the only place where they could go to for grain was that which was stored in Egypt. And so Jacob, his wives, and his sons, they too are impacted by the famine. They are growing hungry and worried about their food. So Jacob hears about all the grain that is in Egypt, and he sent 10 of his sons to go and buy grain. And when they arrive, they bow down before an official named Zaphenath-Paneah, which is the name that Pharaoh had given to Joseph. But his brothers didn't recognize him. It had been over 20 years, and he spoke and he dressed like an Egyptian, which makes me want to break out in a song. He walked like an Egyptian and talked like an Egyptian. And so Joseph saw an opportunity. He wanted to know if his brothers had changed. He wanted to know if they regretted what they had done to him and to his father. He wanted to know if they had changed their hearts. And so he intentionally makes several false allegations against them. He frames them for thievery. So with these false accusations, a well-placed cup, and some apparent life and death situations, Joseph discovers that his brothers, in fact, did change. They regretted what they had done to Joseph. They had regretted what they had done to their father. So Joseph eventually reveals himself to his brothers, and obviously you can imagine how frightened they must have been when he says, "Okay, I'm Joseph, the guy that you sold into slavery." They are worried about what is going to happen. He's second in command of Egypt. Are they about to die? But he forgives them. He knows that God was working to accomplish something greater than himself. So he restores himself to his brothers, and he is reunited with his father after they come into Egypt, and they bring their brother Benjamin, a younger brother that he had never gotten to meet. So his family would eventually move to Egypt and occupy some really nice pasture land, kind of segregated from the rest of the Egyptian population. They lived in that land so that they can endure the famine and continue to survive and grow their flocks. And they would continue to live there even when things got better. But things didn't quite work out for the descendants of Jacob. After many years, a Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph and the history of these Hebrews among them. So in fear, he worked to enslave this fledgling nation. So even so, despite the setback, God would not be done with the descendants of Jacob, who were made to be slaves in Egypt. So you might be tempted to think that the story is all about Joseph. Now there's a lot that we're going to learn about Joseph and about this story over the next few weeks. There's a lot that we can learn about ourselves as we study his story. We can look at our own baggage and see and compare that with his baggage. There is no doubt that Joseph is one of the main characters of this story. But he is not the main character. The main character in this story is God. Despite everything that Joseph faces in his life and in his time in Egypt, it was God who was working to accomplish something that was going to be far greater in impact than just preserving one or two nations. There is something that God was working to do in 1,000 years. God had a plan that he was working to fulfill. God was preserving Jacob's family so that he could continue to fulfill the promise that he made to Abraham, that his descendants would be a great nation, that they would be a blessing to all nations, that they would inherit the land of Canaan. And then from them would come the greatest blessing that the world will ever know. So it's really about God and what God was working to accomplish. So as we listen to the story, we can imagine the suitcases full of regrets that begin to be carried around by the various characters in the story. Joseph, his family, each of his brothers, their father, his mother. They all have their fair share if onlys. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be peeking inside and seeing what they have been carrying around. And we'll also see what happens to their baggage once it's been packed. But we are also going to be confronted by our own bags of regret that we ourselves carry around. We're going to be faced with a choice about what to do with these bags. Are we going to hold onto them? Are we going to continue to walk around with them over our shoulders like this weird guy trying to fit them all on his back as he's trying to go into the shuttle? Are we going to do something with them? Are we going to allow God to do something? Are we going to allow God to replace the regrets and the what-ifs with faith and trust in Him? Are we going to let God free us from their oppressive weight? And if we allow God to do what He's going to do, we know that God will be able to accomplish more in us and through us than what we can currently see. Jesus does not want our baggage and our regrets to hold us back, especially hold us back from Him. He wants to do greater things in and through us, despite the pain, despite the trauma, despite all the guilt that we might have. And He might even use those things for our benefit and for His glory. But we won't know unless we trust Him enough with those things to bring them to Him. Now, we don't expect material success and blessings like Joseph was. We don't expect to be elevated to a position of prominence. We might not be in a position where we are able to save a nation and surrounding areas from famine. But there is much that God wants to do with us and through us. And so here's what I want you to do. I want you to do some serious soul searching. Don't just listen to the life of Joseph and say, oh, that's an amazing story. Don't just think, oh, people have regrets in life. I want you to think about the baggage that you are carrying. Think about the regrets that are crushing your spine and bringing you down and discouraging you and holding you back from God. Now, I don't want you to go back and dwell on things that you've already given back to God in the past. There's no use in being regretful about things that are already gone and done and taken care of. I want us to think about the things that we are currently carrying, especially the things that we know that are holding us back, causing us stress, guilt, and shame. We need to be open and honest with God and ourselves about what is going on. But Jesus doesn't want us to just think about those things and throw ourselves a pity party and say, oh, woe is me, I have all of this regrets. No, Jesus wants to turn these regrets into something beautiful. But we need to recognize that we are carrying them in the first place. And once we see that they are there, once we see that we have bags slung on our back and our shoulders, we've got our arms loaded with bags, we need to not hold on. We need to give them to Jesus and find the healing, the peace, and the strength that He offers.